Hi, my name is John Swanson. I'm the Global Category Manager for the Road program here at Giant. And what I want to talk to you about today is the new TCR series. When we start talking about TCR, one of the things we have to look back at is the history of the TCR. Back in the early to mid-90s, we introduced TCR to the world through racing. It was actually such a radical design at the time that the UCI banned it from racing. Obviously, they've relaxed on that issue, but the reality is that the TCR was one of the very first world-class all-around racing machines that was ever brought to the earth. So what we wanted to do for model year 16 and beyond is bring the TCR back to that glory, bring it back to the front, and show the world this is how you build a world-class racing machine. When you start talking about an ultimate racing machine, one of the things you have to look at is the overall stiffness of the bike. When we talk about the overall stiffness, what we're talking about is when you put effort into those pedals, how much of that effort actually translates into forward motion. From an outright stiffness standpoint, the TCR has been the top of its class since its inception. This new bike is no different. What we really wanted to do was maximize its stiffness in terms of its forward moving efficiency and try to reduce weight as much as possible. That is a very, very difficult thing to pull off. To reduce weight and increase stiffness is not something you can just do. It took a lot of research, it took a lot of time and a lot of headaches from myself and the engineering staff to bring this bike to where it is right now. We've cut a significant amount of weight out and we've managed to increase the overall stiffness of the bike at the same time. So when we start talking about how did we increase stiffness and lose weight, that's the billion-dollar answer to the billion-dollar question. When you want to look at it, you start at the beginning, you start at the front and you work your way back. And it's all in the details. Sometimes a minor detail by itself doesn't look like much. When you do a bunch of those minor details, you put them all together, it's truly the sum of its parts, which is where we get a very high stiffness to weight ratio. Looking at the front of the bike, you can see the head tube has been slimmed down and cleaned up from the outgoing version. From there, that transitions into the down tube. The iconic design piece of the TCR is that rectangular down tube. It gives you a tremendous amount of stiffness, as well as the tube shaping allows you to use a lower amount of material to keep that same amount of stiffness. The head tube transitioning into the fork is another place that we've lost some weight and increased stiffness. The upper fork crown design is completely new to the TCR side as well as Giant as a whole. It's much more of a taper versus a squared off edge where the bearing sits. That taper allows us to use less material in a smoother continuous piece to increase the stiffness and lose some of the weight at the same time. Moving from there down into the bottom bracket and C-tube area, it's very beefy. It's very big, very stiff, very strong. Larger diameter tubes tend to be stronger. You can use a little bit less material and you get that stiffness to weight ratio that you're looking for. Moving out into the back, you have a hollow carbon fiber dropout in the Advanced SL series, aluminum on everything below that. Very slim, but very optimally shaped seat stays with a solid yoke at the top. This yoke at the top is actually hollow. The hollow solid yoke is actually stiffer and lighter than the outgoing A-frame style. What's very obvious is the ISP shaping. We're able to keep a very square tube down where it counts, but then we're able to slim it down and clean it up a little bit versus the outgoing version, which reduced weight as well as increased ride quality. You can see that it shares a slight visual similarity to the outgoing Vector, but in a much smaller, sleeker design. By redoing the shape and shrinking it down, we're obviously able to cut some weight, maintain or increase that stiffness like I talked about before, but by making that new shape and that new design, we're able to control the wall thickness a little bit better, which gives you much greater vertical compliance. When you start looking at the cable routing on the bike, one of the things that stands out is there's fewer holes on the bike. The fewer holes you put in carbon, the lighter it is, which seems to be counterintuitive, but if you think that if you put a hole in carbon fiber, you have to reinforce that hole to take up for the lack of material. Well, if you've already got one hole and you make it a little bit bigger to allow two cables to go in it, it actually doesn't add any weight versus having just a singular hole for a singular cable. So by cutting off one entire hole, making one a little bit bigger, we're actually losing weight by using one hole. When you look at how the brakes go in, as well as the shifter cables on the other side, all of those things are singular holes optimized for their very specific purpose. So outside of the inherent frame design pieces, a couple other places we've lost some weight would be the saddle clamp and even something as simple as headset spacers and top cap. When you look at the saddle clamp, it's obviously much smaller than the outgoing version. We've been able to retain the dual adjustability, meaning that there's a rearward setting and a forward setting, but we've been able to do it using less material. Just out of the seat clamp alone, we've saved 50 grams. When you look at something as innocuous as a headset spacer and a top cap, on this one we redesigned them and slimmed them down and shaved out as much material as possible. This setup here versus the outgoing setup, you shave 40 grams, just out of a top cap and a few headset spacers. One of the key tenets for TCR and its entire history has been about its handling and its geometry. When you start looking at a performance machine, you're constantly trying to eke just a little bit more out of it, regardless of what it is. No matter how good it is at the moment, you always want more. So what we've done with the new TCR is we've actually taken the feedback from our world-class and world tour racers and riders, and we've actually changed the geometry just a tiny little bit. Small minor tweaks have made this bike much more stable and quicker at the same time versus the outgoing version. I think for me, one of the best things about the new TCR was the story of my first ride on the bike. I'd seen all the numbers, I'd seen all the data. We knew it was going to be a good bike. We knew what the weight was going to be. We knew what the stiffness was going to be. But none of that stuff really comes together until you ride it the first time. And when I got on the bike for the very first time, I rode for about 3 hours. And one of the first things I noticed straight away was when you stand up on the bike and you put pressure into the pedals, the bike doesn't move. It was a bit of a strange sensation at first, but a very good sensation. Once I rode the bike a little bit further and started getting more and more used to it, it became second nature. Typically, when you're riding a bike and you put that pressure in, the bike is going to kind of push back on you a little bit. Well, the new TCR doesn't move. There's no absorption and pushback. It just simply doesn't move. Everything you put into the pedal stroke translates into forward motion, and it was a phenomenal feeling, and it made me really, really happy and really excited for other people to get on the bike and experience the exact same feeling. I'm really excited for you to get on the TCR for the first time and to share this experience with some of your friends and your coworkers and everybody else involved. I really hope that when you ride the bike for the first time, you can actually feel all the effort and work my team and I put into making this bike truly the best performance machine on the planet. So after everything you just saw, here's some of the data and how we accumulate that data to back up what I'm talking about. The first thing we talk about is the frame weight testing. What we do is we actually go out and purchase production frames, all size medium, everything's painted, decaled, completely production forks which are uncut, headset expanders, top caps, seat posts or ISPs with clamps, front and rear derailleur hangers, and all production hardware, water bottle bolts, headset top cap bolts, all those sorts of things. And we start adding in some of the proprietary parts or the spec parts like the wheels to help determine the efficiency of a complete system. So the chart we're looking at now is the FRAMESET weight testing. Like I said before, what we do is we take the production frame, fork, post, clamps or ISP clamp, derailleur hangers, expanders, top caps, and headset spacers. That equals a complete frame set, which you can see the list down on the right. The other thing that we've added into here, which is the third column over from that, is the total when you start adding in the wheel set that is spec'd with a given model. One of the things I want to point out, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know this to be true, we are not afraid to show the truth. When you start looking down the frame set weight list, we are not the lightest frame out there. And that's okay. I'm going to explain to you how we got to this point in just a second. So the first test we're going to talk about here is arguably the most important. This is the frame set stiffness. This is the simulation of what your frame goes through and how much it resists the torsional load that you're going to put on it, namely when you're sprinting or cornering. The test procedure is where the frame is secured at the rear dropouts, the fork is installed with a headset and a dummy stem, and then you put lateral force at the end of the dropout and you start measuring the amount of twist. And this measurement is done in Newton meters per degree. What it basically means is that the higher the value, the stiffer the frame set. The stiffer the frame set, the better it's going to handle when you're actually riding it in extreme conditions. Like I mentioned before, one of the goals with the new TCR was to make the best handling all-around race machine on the planet. And when you start looking at the frame set stiffness, that is exactly where we ended up. We are hands down the number one in terms of frame set stiffness. And when you start looking at frame set stiffness from the highest to the least, what you're going to notice is a huge disparity. You're looking at nearly 40 Newton meters. And to put this in some sort of a context, the idea between the top and the bottom is kind of like comparing uncooked pasta with pasta that you've overcooked and then let sit in a pot for 2 days, wet and loose. One segment that's important to take a look at is what is the frame stiffness to weight ratio. What this means is for how many Newton meters per kilogram your bike resists that torsional stiffness. Now obviously it's the higher the better. And when you do this, this is the tricky part about building a high-end race machine. It's very, very easy to make a super light bike. Super easy. Anybody can do it. They're all over the place. You can pick them off a shelf at any factory anywhere in the world. The trick is how do you make a light bike that still handles well? And the way that you can tell you've got a light bike that's going to handle well is by looking at your frame stiffness to weight ratio numbers. When you look at this data, it's clear to see that we've done our homework and we've done it correctly. The next test we're going to talk about is FRAMESET pedaling stiffness. How this test is run is that we fix the fork into a stationary spot. The rear end is loosely fixed in, the crank is set at a 45-degree angle, and we then apply load to the end of the crank arm. And what we do is we measure the amount of deflection at that point. This measurement gives us an idea in Newton meters how much the bike actually moves under pedaling load. When you start looking at the numbers for the pedaling stiffness, it's very, very important to understand that at a certain point, a customer coming in to buy a bike is no longer strong enough to push it past this point. That number is somewhere around the mid-60s. Basically, if you have a frame that tests above 64, 65 Newton meters, it doesn't matter anymore. You could be 66 Newton meters, you could be 166 Newton meters, it doesn't matter anymore. But what does matter is if your bike tests below that. And if you look at half of the bikes we tested at, they're really, really low on the scale, well below where they need to be. One of the new tests you're going to see here is our own test. And this test was born out of simple curiosity. What we wanted to see was what does the complete package look like when you put wheels on it. So basically what we do is we put a bike together. The wheels are then fixed to the ground. The bike is tilted at 10 degrees just like it is in the pedaling test. We apply load to the end of the crank and we measure the overall deflection and power transmission of the bike. When you start looking at the end result for the FRAMESET and WHEELSET pedaling stiffness test that I just described, what you'll notice is a number. And that number is a measurement of newtons per millimeter per kilogram. Hopefully that makes sense. So basically what you're looking at is what sort of a transmission stiffness are you getting out of a complete system with a given wheel set that's spec'd on these bikes. All the results are listed on the chart you're seeing right now. The reality here is that I've given you a bunch of data, and you are free to share this data with anybody you want. The reality though is that you're not going to know exactly what I'm talking about until you actually get on the bike and turn your first pedal. Then you're going to see exactly what the new TCR is all about.